Millionaire discovers his maid is giving her baby up for adoption. What he does next will shock you. Alexander Reed woke up on a Saturday morning exactly like hundreds of other mornings in his life. No alarm clock, no voice calling him awake, no smell of breakfast being prepared, only absolute silence enveloping the vast mansion on the outskirts of the city. He lay still on the king-size bed, the high, cold ceiling above him stretching like an endless void. The bedroom was large enough to hold several more people, yet so empty it felt suffocating. Alexander raised a hand to cover his eyes and exhaled slowly, as if every morning required a small measure of courage just to begin. His mansion was the kind of place many people dreamed of. 4 bedrooms, a heated swimming pool, a private gym, a spacious garden, and a direct view of a lush green valley. Everything was perfect, arranged with precision down to the smallest detail. Yet that very perfection made it feel more like a showroom than a home. Alexander Reed, 40 years old, was a successful businessman in real estate investment and development. He had built his career from nothing, working 16 hours a day for nearly 2 decades to reach where he was today. Money had never been a problem, and likely never would be. But success could not buy warmth. Alexander walked down the marble staircase, his footsteps echoing through the empty space. He passed the expansive living room, where the expensive sofa had never held the imprint of a family gathered together. The modern kitchen gleamed, spotless, yet no laughter had ever surrounded the dining table. Since the divorce, the house had always been like this, silent, cold, and empty. Alexander poured himself a cup of black coffee and stood by the large window overlooking the garden. Outside, the morning sunlight fell gently, birds chirping sporadically among the trees, a scene of perfect tranquility. But inside him, nothing stirred. Saturdays were always the worst. No work to escape into, no meetings to keep him busy. Just him. And the feeling that despite having everything, he was still missing something money could never fill. The silence of the mansion sometimes pulled Alexander Reed back into the past, to the days when he still believed this place would one day be filled with laughter. Back then, he did not live alone. Sophia Reed once entered his life like a powerful gust of wind. Intelligent, sharp, ambitious, and always certain of what she wanted. They met at an investment gala, a place where handshakes were measured by the value of contracts. Alexander was drawn to her from the very beginning. Sophia was different from the women he had known before. She was independent, confident, and needed no one to lean on. They fell in love quickly, and they married just as quickly. At the time, Alexander believed love was enough, that differences would be smoothed out over time. He believed that once they were husband and wife, they would build a family together, the kind of family he had always longed for. But he was wrong. Their marriage unfolded within packed schedules, back-to-back business trips, dinners canceled because of late meetings. And then one evening, when Alexander mentioned having a child, Sophia laughed, not a joyful laugh, but the kind of laugh that made it seem as though he had just said something naive and out of place. "I wasn't born to be a mother," she said bluntly, her voice calm but final. "My career is taking off. I won't trade it away." Alexander assumed it was only an initial reaction. He was patient. He tried to persuade her. He spoke of mornings with a child running through the house, of family vacations, of a real home. He even suggested hiring a nanny, full-time help. But every word he spoke only pushed Sophia further away. Conversation turned into argument. Argument turned into silence. And the silence stretched on until there was nothing left to save. Sophia did not cry when she signed the divorce papers. She signed her name neatly, took her share of the assets, and left as if she were closing a contract that no longer served its purpose. No resentment, no hesitation. Alexander remained in the house, and with a dream buried. He never blamed Sophia for not wanting children. What hurt him most was knowing that his dream of becoming a father had been treated as something negotiable, something disposable. From that day on, Alexander told himself that family was not something everyone was meant to have. Some people were born to succeed, but not to be husbands, not to be fathers. He threw himself deeper into work, earned more money, built more houses, bought more land. But with every new room, one truth became clearer. Success could fill a bank account, but it could not fill the emptiness in his heart. And then, just when Alexander believed he had grown accustomed to such a life, fate quietly placed a young woman named Emily Carter into that empty house. Without him realizing, it would change everything. Emily Carter entered Alexander Reed's life quietly, exactly the way she had existed in the world for the past 26 years. She had been working in his house for nearly 2 years. At first, it was only a few days a week, cleaning, doing laundry, keeping the vast mansion tidy and orderly. Emily arrived early, left on time, never complained, never asked for anything beyond the original agreement. She worked quickly, precisely, and was almost invisible. Alexander rarely paid attention to the household staff, not out of disdain, but because he was accustomed to forming no attachments. Keeping distance was the easiest way to avoid complications. Emily, in his eyes, was simply part of the familiar routine, someone who came, worked, and left. But over the past few weeks, Alexander had begun to notice small details he had never paid attention to before. Emily had visibly lost weight. Her face, already pale, now looked more hollow and drawn. Beneath her downcast brown eyes were dark circles, as if she hadn't slept properly for many days. Her hands sometimes trembled slightly when she held the bottle of floor cleaner. At times, Alexander would catch her standing motionless in the middle of the living room, her gaze empty, as though her mind were somewhere very far away. She was no longer completely silent, but not because she spoke more, rather because Alexander occasionally heard very soft sighs, suppressed sniffles, sounds that quickly disappeared whenever he appeared. Something was wrong. Alexander knew it, but he didn't ask, partly because he didn't know where to begin, partly because he was used to not interfering in other people's lives. Everyone had their own problems, and Emily, despite looking fragile, always did her job well. Until that Saturday morning. Emily arrived as usual, but this time she was a few minutes late. She apologized in a soft voice, avoiding his eyes. Alexander nodded, didn't think much of it, and went up to his office. But less than half an hour later, as he walked past the laundry area, he heard a strange sound. Not the washing machine. Crying. Very faint. As if the person crying were trying not to let anyone hear. Alexander stopped. He stood still for a few seconds, hesitating. This was not his business. He should turn away. But his legs did not listen to reason. He stepped closer. Through the crack of the door, Alexander saw Emily standing with her back to him, both hands braced against the washing machine, her shoulders trembling with each breath. She kept wiping her face, as if trying to erase every trace of weakness. Before becoming the woman standing silently crying, inside Alexander Reed's luxurious mansion, Emily Carter had been accustomed to a completely different kind of life. A life with no pauses, no choices, only survival, stretched day after day. Emily woke up every morning at 4 o'clock, not because she was more diligent than others, but because Lucas never slept through the night. The 4-month-old baby often woke from hunger, from the cold, from the fragile stomach pains of infancy. Things Emily could do nothing about except hold him close and whisper apologies. The room where the three of them lived was just large enough to fit an old bed, a worn plastic crib, and a small gas stove pressed against the wall. In summer, the room was hot like a furnace. In winter, cold seeped through every rotten crack in the door, biting into the skin. But it was all Emily could afford to rent. She lived with her mother, Margaret Carter, a woman in her 60s with a weak heart and diabetes that had progressed to a dangerous stage. Margaret needed daily medication, regular checkups, and a lifestyle Emily could never fully provide. Emily tried. She did everything within her power. She cleaned houses for multiple families, running from one home to another, the smell of cleaning chemicals clinging to her sleeves. She ate less to save money for her son's milk. Some days, her only meal was a slice of dry bread and a glass of water. Daniel Moore, the man who had once said he would stay with her forever, disappeared without a trace the moment he learned Emily was pregnant. His phone number was blocked. His old address was empty. Every promise dissolved into meaningless echoes in her memory. Emily had never once considered giving up her child. Never. Even while living in poverty, she believed her love was enough. But love did not make her mother healthy again. Love did not fill the bottle with milk, and love did not help Emily buy medicine. 3 weeks earlier, Margaret had collapsed inside the house. The doctor spoke plainly, without evasion. Without proper treatment, she might not live more than 6 months. The cost of treatment was far beyond anything Emily could imagine. A few days later, Emily's phone rang. A social worker, professional and calm, asked a question Emily had never imagined she would hear. "Have you ever considered placing your child for adoption?" Emily hung up immediately. She sat holding Lucas in her arms, crying until there were no tears left. But the question did not disappear. It followed her in every step she took. Every time Lucas smiled, every time Margaret coughed in pain. Lucas deserved a decent home, a doctor when he was sick, enough food, a childhood that did not begin with deprivation. And Emily could only give him love. But that love was slowly becoming a burden. Finally, on a cold, rainy morning, Emily walked into the building where decisions that changed human destinies were processed. She listened to dry explanations of procedures and signed the first document with trembling hands. She had 48 hours to complete everything, 48 hours to prepare to give her child to someone else. When Emily folded the papers and placed them into her bag, she knew she had reached her final limit. Not because she did not love her child, but because she loved him enough to endure the greatest pain of her life. Alexander stood at the doorway of the laundry room for several long seconds, unsure whether to speak or quietly turn away. He had never been good at facing other people's emotions, especially ones as raw as this. But the trembling in Emily's posture made it impossible for him to pretend he hadn't seen anything. He cleared his throat softly. "Emily, are you all right?" She startled and turned around, her red-rimmed eyes widening in alarm. Almost by reflex, Emily quickly wiped her face, forcing a weak smile, a smile that never reached her eyes. "Yes, Mr. Reed. I'm sorry. I'm just a little tired." Alexander looked at her in silence. The answer was painfully familiar, the answer of those accustomed to enduring, to hiding, to telling themselves everything was fine, even as they were falling apart inside. His gaze drifted down to the washing machine, where the stack of papers still lay, not yet put away. Thick printed pages, small text, the clear stamp of a legal authority in the upper corner. Alexander's stomach tightened. "What are those?" he asked, his voice low and slow without judgment. Emily stiffened. For a few seconds, she seemed to be fighting a fierce battle with herself. Then her shoulders sagged, as if she no longer had the strength to keep hiding. Tears welled up again, this time no longer restrained. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want you to see this." Alexander took one step closer, but still kept his distance. "If you don't want to talk about it, I won't force you." Emily shook her head. "No? Maybe I can't hide it anymore?" She took a deep breath, clasping her hands together as if holding on to her last bit of courage. "I have a child," Emily said. "A baby boy. His name is Lucas. He's only 4 months old." Alexander froze. In the 2 years she had worked there, he had never once heard Emily mention her family, never seen her take an urgent call or ask for time off because of a sick child. The revelation stunned him. "Your son?" he asked softly. Emily nodded. "I'm a single mother." She spoke in an even tone, as if reciting a story she had been forced to repeat too many times. A man named Daniel Moore had entered her life with empty promises, then disappeared the moment he learned she was pregnant. Not a single call, not a single explanation. Emily raised her child in a cramped room, together with her sick elderly mother. She worked multiple jobs at once, sleeping no more than 3 hours a night. Every dollar she earned was divided between rent, medication, milk, and diapers for Lucas. Her voice trembled when she spoke of her mother. "She needs treatment for her heart and diabetes. I have no other choice." Emily lowered her head. "Those papers, they're the adoption documents for my son." The room seemed to fall silent. Alexander felt a cold rush run down his spine. The legal terms he had seen moments earlier now carried a cruelty greater than any number he had ever dealt with in major business deals. "You're planning to give your child to someone else?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily broke down, sobbing. "I don't want to. You don't understand. I love my son more than anything in this world." She covered her mouth, trying to stifle her cries. "But love isn't enough. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough strength. I'm making my child suffer." Alexander stood motionless. In that moment, the image of a newborn being torn from his mother's arms because of poverty struck straight at his heart. And at the same time, an old pain, deep, familiar, rose within him. "How much time do you have left?" Alexander Reed asked, his voice low but urgent. Emily Carter looked down at the old watch on her wrist, as if the numbers might somehow change. 46 hours, she answered quietly. "Monday, exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon." "Emily," he said, his voice lowering but firm, "you don't need to come back here this weekend. Go home. Be with Lucas." She froze. "But my work—" "It doesn't matter," he cut in. "Go. Spend all your time with your child. And please, don't sign any papers before we meet again on Monday morning." Emily didn't understand why a cold businessman like Alexander Reed would say such things. But in his eyes there was no pity, only a resolve she couldn't quite name. She nodded, silently picked up her bag, and left, tears streaming down her face. After Emily left, the mansion sank back into silence. But this time the silence no longer felt familiar. It was heavy, pressing down on Alexander Reed's chest like a wordless accusation. He stood alone in the laundry room for a long time, staring at the papers Emily had accidentally left behind. Dry, cold lines of text, written to legalize a tragedy. Consent for adoption. Just a few words, yet behind them stood a 4-month-old child and a mother, pushed to her absolute limit. Alexander picked up one of the pages and read it line by line. He had signed hundreds of contracts in his life, had grown numb to numbers so large they no longer carried meaning. But never before had a legal document made his hands tremble like this. He poured himself a glass of liquor and sat down on the sofa in the vast living room. He didn't turn on the lights. Dim city light filtered in through the glass windows. This house was always quiet, but tonight it felt as though it were staring straight at him, waiting. Alexander thought of Emily, a young, fragile woman working relentlessly, carrying burdens she should never have had to bear. He thought of Lucas, a baby who had barely begun to understand the world, already facing the risk of losing his mother. Then he thought of himself. The house had 4 bedrooms, yet only one was occupied. The other 3 were always closed, clean, empty, lifeless. He had enough money to change the lives of 10 families without a second thought. The amount Emily needed to save her mother was no more than a dinner he had once paid for without hesitation. Alexander stood up and walked up the stairs. He opened the door to one of the empty rooms. A single bed, a wardrobe, a window overlooking the garden. Nothing else. A room that had never known laughter, never known life. He stood there for a long time. Sophia's voice from years ago echoed in his mind. "If you want children, find someone else." Back then, Alexander had accepted it. No arguments, no resistance. He had convinced himself that fatherhood was simply not his destiny. But tonight, for the first time in many years, Alexander asked himself, had he given up too easily? Was helping Emily interference? Or was it simply using what he had to prevent a tragedy that could still be avoided? If he turned away, Lucas would grow up in another family, and Emily would live the rest of her life with the pain of giving up her child. And he would continue living in this empty house, carrying yet another story he could have changed. Alexander closed his eyes. A truth emerged so clear he could not deny it. Emily did not want to give her child away. She was being forced by circumstances, and he had the power to change those circumstances. When the clock struck 3 a.m, Alexander Reed no longer had any doubts. The decision had been made. No further reasons needed. No one's permission required. He picked up his phone, looked at Emily's name on the screen for a few seconds, then set it down. Not yet, but very soon he would say what he had decided. That night, Alexander did not sleep. But for the first time in many years, his sleeplessness did not come from emptiness, but from a spark of hope, newly lit inside his once-cold home. On Sunday morning, Alexander Reed called Emily Carter at 10 minutes to 7. His finger hovered over the phone screen for a few seconds before he pressed call, as if that single touch alone could change the fate of many lives. Emily answered almost immediately. Her voice was panicked, still heavy with sleep. "Mr. Reed? Is something wrong?" "Emily, I need to see you today," Alexander said, his voice calm but firm. "It's very important." There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. Then she asked softly, "Today?" "Yes, 10 o'clock this morning. Bring Lucas and your mother. Come to my house." "But why?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "Please come, before you sign any papers." When Emily hung up, her heart was racing. She didn't understand what was happening, only that her time was nearly gone. The following afternoon, she was supposed to be at the authorities' office to complete the final procedures. At 10 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. Alexander opened the door and froze for a moment. Emily stood there, holding Lucas in her arms, the baby wrapped in a worn blanket. Beside her was Margaret Carter, thin, leaning on a makeshift cane, her face pale with exhaustion. The contrast between their two worlds was painfully clear. Alexander invited them inside. Emily walked slowly, her eyes darting around as if afraid to touch anything. Margaret sat down on a chair, her back straight, her gaze wary. "You said you wanted to talk," Emily began quietly. Alexander took a deep breath. He had prepared for this moment all night, but seeing Lucas in his mother's arms made every word feel heavier. "Emily," he said slowly, "you plan to place Lucas for adoption because you don't have the financial means to raise him and care for your mother. Is that correct?" Emily nodded, tears welling up. "I don't have any other choice." "And if you did have a choice?" Alexander asked. Emily looked up. "I don't understand." "If you had the means to stay with your child," he continued, "would you still want to give Lucas to someone else?" The room grew so quiet that every breath could be heard. Emily shook her head, almost in despair. "Of course not, but I don't." Alexander looked straight at her. "You don't, but I do." Margaret immediately stood up, bracing herself on her cane. "We don't need charity," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "My daughter is an honest working woman." "Chandi." Alexander rose as well. I'm not offering charity, Mrs. Margaret. I'm offering an agreement. He turned to Emily. You, Lucas, and your mother will move in here. Emily went completely still. I will cover all of your mother's medical expenses. You will work here full-time, with a clear contract, a fixed salary, and full insurance. Lucas will stay with you. There will be no adoption. No, that's impossible, Emily whispered. Why would you do this? Alexander was silent for a few seconds, then said something he had never said to anyone before. Because I have always wanted a family, and I can't stand by and watch a child lose his mother simply because of money. Margaret stared at him. What do you want in return? I want Lucas to grow up beside his mother, Alexander replied. That's all. Emily burst into tears. Everything was happening too fast, too overwhelmingly. I need time to think. Alexander nodded. You have until tomorrow afternoon. After that, either you sign those papers or you come back here and start a new life. When they left, Alexander stood alone in the living room. For the first time in many years, he did not feel that the house was empty anymore. It was waiting. Emily stayed awake the entire Sunday night. Lucas woke up 3 times. The 4-month-old cried restlessly in his worn crib. Emily lifted him into her arms, pressed her cheek against his chest, and murmured the familiar lullabies under her breath. She prepared his milk, changed his diaper, repeating movements that had long since become instinctive. Her hands never stopped working, but her mind drifted somewhere else. Alexander Reed's offer echoed in her head, clear enough to make her shiver. You can move in and live at my house. You, Lucas, and your mother. It sounded like a story that did not belong to her life. Things like that existed only in movies, not in the reality of a 26-year-old woman accustomed to scarcity and suspicion. Emily had never accepted help without a price. She had worked since she was very young, carrying everything on her own shoulders. Margaret, her mother, repeated over and over in a tired but firm voice, "Rich people never give anything for free." I know, Emily replied softly, but this time, it feels different. Feelings can deceive you. True intentions don't reveal themselves right away. Emily knew her mother was not wrong. Life had never operated on pure kindness. But what if this time was an exception? What if Alexander truly just wanted to help? Nothing more, nothing less? She thought of Monday afternoon, 2 o'clock, the courtroom, the papers waiting for her final signature. She thought of the moment she would have to hand Lucas over to a social worker. She imagined his tiny hands reaching out in panic. The thought made her chest ache as if it were being crushed. Then she remembered the other option. A door that had just opened. So beautiful, it was terrifying. At 8 in the morning, Emily called Alexander. He answered almost immediately. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice trembling slightly but clear. "I've been considering your offer, but I need a few conditions." "Go ahead," he said. "I want a transparent agreement. I will work and be paid for my work, not live on charity. I also want my mother to receive full treatment, but without feeling indebted." She paused briefly, then continued. "If one day you no longer need me, I need time to make arrangements. I don't want to be asked to leave immediately." On the other end of the line, Alexander gave a soft chuckle, not mocking, but satisfied. He recognized in Emily a rare sense of self-respect and clarity. "All of that is reasonable," he replied. "You'll have an official employment contract, a fixed salary of $3,000 a month, housing included, health insurance for you, your son, and your mother." "If I change my decision," he added, "you'll have 6 months to prepare. Would that give you peace of mind?" Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "That's enough." "Then we're agreed." Tears spilled down her cheeks, unstoppable. "Yes, I agree. You can come this afternoon. The room is ready." When the call ended, Emily turned around to see Margaret quietly wiping away tears. "You're really going to do this?" she asked. Emily held Lucas tightly in her arms. "I don't know what's waiting ahead," she said slowly, "but this is the only path that lets me stay with my son." Outside, the morning had fully arrived, and for the first time in a very long while, Emily felt that the future, fragile as it was still within reach. That afternoon, Emily Carter returned to the mansion with 2 old suitcases and a baby bag with a frayed strap. There wasn't much to bring. Most of her life was packed into a few changes of clothes, a handful of items for Lucas, and her mother's medicine. The car stopped at the gate. Emily stepped out first, carrying Lucas in her arms. Margaret followed slowly behind, cautious and unsteady. Alexander Reed was already waiting. He didn't say much, only opened the door and invited them inside, as if they had always belonged there. Alexander showed them around the house. Emily and Lucas's room was on the 2nd floor with a large window overlooking the garden. Inside, there was a new crib, a small dresser for baby clothes, and a rocking chair placed beside the window. Emily froze. She reached out and lightly touched the edge of the crib, as if afraid everything might be an illusion. Margaret's room was right next door. The bed was adjustable, the air conditioner hummed softly, and the private bathroom had been carefully fitted with support rails. Margaret sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. She was used to enduring pain, used to suffering. This sudden comfort left her with no response other than silent tears. "A doctor will come to examine you tomorrow morning," Alexander said gently. "We'll begin treatment right away." Emily turned to him, her eyes red. "Thank you," she whispered. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Alexander replied. "Just stay." The first few days passed slowly, as if all 3 of them were learning how to breathe in a new space. Emily still woke up early, still cleaned and cooked on her own initiative. But Alexander often reminded her to rest. "You live here now," he said. "You don't have to do everything by yourself." Margaret began receiving regular medical care. The doctors said she would need heart surgery soon. Alexander arranged everything, without delay, without hesitation. When Margaret heard the news, she broke down in tears. "I thought I was going to die," she said. Alexander simply replied, "Not in this house." Lucas was the one who changed the mansion the fastest. His cries echoed through the night. His giggles filled the daytime. The once silent living room now had soft rugs, small toys, and sterilized baby bottles neatly lined up in the kitchen. Alexander began to adjust to the new rhythm of life. He learned to speak more softly, to walk more slowly. In the evenings, he would stand outside Emily's door, listening to her lull Lucas to sleep, and for the first time in many years, he didn't feel that the house was too large. It was no longer a mansion. It was slowly becoming a home. Alexander Reed didn't realize when the change happened. He only knew that, little by little, his life began to revolve around a child who did not share his blood. Lucas usually woke up around 6 in the morning. At first, Emily was always the one to get up, lifting him from the crib so as not to disturb Alexander. But one morning, just as she set her foot on the floor, the door opened. Alexander stood there, his hair still tousled, his voice low and hesitant. "Let me try feeding him." Emily hesitated. Lucas was still so small, and Alexander had never cared for a child in his life. But the seriousness and caution in his eyes made her nod. Alexander held Lucas awkwardly, as if cradling something both fragile and priceless. The baby whimpered softly, then gradually grew quiet as the bottle touched his lips. Sitting on the sofa, Lucas wrapped his tiny hand tightly around Alexander's finger. That grip made Alexander's heart tighten. A strange, deep sensation spread through his chest. Not responsibility, not pity, but a pure bond, one that needed no reason. From that day on, Alexander began to be more present in Lucas's life. He learned how to change diapers, how to prepare milk at the right temperature, how to soothe a crying child. He did everything slowly, carefully, afraid of doing something wrong. Emily watched it all in silence. She had never imagined that any man could treat her son with such patience and gentleness. The house changed day by day. The living room filled with toys. The kitchen carried the scent of baby porridge. The hallway lingered with the smell of baby powder. Alexander no longer worked late every night. He came home early, sat on the floor playing with Lucas, letting his phone vibrate unanswered in his pocket. Margaret gradually recovered after her heart surgery. She no longer needed a cane to walk, and smiles appeared more often on her face. She looked at Alexander differently now, no longer with suspicion, only with deep gratitude. Emily changed as well. The dark circles beneath her eyes faded. She ate better. She smiled more. Yet, every time she caught Alexander's gaze, her heart raced for reasons she could not explain. She told herself it was only gratitude, just appreciation for the man who had saved her family. But the evenings they spent sitting together on the porch, talking about childhood memories and unfinished dreams, made it impossible for Emily to keep deceiving herself. Alexander felt it too. He realized he was beginning to anticipate Emily's footsteps in the house, to look forward to their small conversations, to wait for the moment Lucas smiled when he saw him. But he didn't dare say anything. He was afraid of breaking the fragile balance they shared. The line between family and love grew increasingly blurred, and though neither of them spoke it aloud, both knew. It was inevitable. 6 months passed since the day Emily Carter and her son first stepped into Alexander Reed's mansion. 6 months, enough time for a house to change, for strangers to become family, and for wounded hearts to learn how to trust again. Lucas was now nearly 10 months old. He crawled all over the living room, dragging toys behind him, laughing out loud whenever Alexander called his name. Alexander watched every small change in Lucas with the attentiveness of a true father. The first time Lucas pulled himself up to stand, the first time he clapped his hands, the first time he babbled meaningless sounds filled with effort. Then one afternoon, while Emily was preparing dinner, Lucas held onto the coffee table and took a few unsteady steps toward Alexander, who was sitting across from him. Alexander instinctively opened his arms, his heart pounding. "Come here," he said softly. Lucas wobbled a few more steps and then fell into his arms. The room suddenly burst with laughter and tears. Emily covered her mouth, choking back emotion. Margaret stood nearby, quietly wiping away tears. In that moment, Lucas looked up at Alexander with wide eyes and clearly spoke a single word. "Dad." Alexander froze. The entire world seemed to stop. A simple word, but one he had believed he would never hear. He held Lucas tightly against his chest, tears spilling freely. Emily stepped forward and wrapped her arms around both of them. No one said a word, but everyone understood. That evening, after Lucas had fallen asleep, Alexander and Emily sat on the porch. The city lights shimmered in the distance. Alexander took a deep breath. "Emily," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I don't want to live without you and Lucas anymore." Emily turned to look at him. All the doubts, all the fears within her had long since faded away. Only a clear truth remained. Alexander knelt down and took out a simple ring. "Not out of gratitude, not because of circumstance, but because I love you. Will you marry me?" Emily burst into tears. She nodded without hesitation. "Yes, I will." Their wedding was simple, held in the garden. Lucas, now steady on his feet, carried the wedding rings in his tiny hands, fell once, then stood up and walked on. Everyone laughed through tears. No extravagance, no display, only peace. 1 year later, Emily became pregnant. When she told Alexander, he said nothing for several seconds, then broke down crying like a child. He knelt in front of her, gently placing his hand on her belly, as if afraid of hurting the miracle growing there. Their daughter was born on a spring morning. Alexander held the baby in his arms, while Lucas stood beside him, looking at his sister with curiosity. "Little sister," the boy said, his voice young but full of pride. The house now held not just the laughter of one child, but of two. Emily continued studying management and joined Alexander in running their work. Together, they established a foundation to support single mothers, helping other women avoid having to choose between their children and survival. Many years later, when someone asked Lucas who his biological father was, he simply smiled. "I have one who gave me life and one who chose to be my father every day." Alexander Reed finally understood. Family is not blood. Family is a choice, and